Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio Pais.
And today we are doing a special podcast where we answer some of your questions. So it's a Q&A where we've taken some of the questions that people have sent in on our Facebook page, and we are going to answer your questions today. So how do you feel about that, Uranio? How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. And I love interacting with our listeners because, it's my task as a 5 on the Enneagram to grow this way, to listen more and talk more. So I'm excited.
Yes, and I think it's good too because we're always wondering, what should we talk about that people are really interested in? What do people want to know most about the Enneagram, and how can we speak to that when we think about the topics for our podcast? So I like that we're doing this kind of a podcast, and I think we'll do this every once in a while where we answer questions that people are interested in knowing the answer to. So we'll keep asking for your questions, and feel free to send them in because we want to speak to what people want to know.
There were so many good questions that we decided to do actually 2 episodes with these batch of questions already. And also we got so many ideas for new episodes of the Enneagram 2.0. So thank you who has sent out your opinions and questions.
So the first question we'll address has to do with types and typing. And we got several questions along the same vein, asking how do we differentiate between specific types and the dominant instinct? How do we decide what our instinctual sequence is? How do we understand what type we are, given that the instinct plays a role? And I want to first of all point out that we did a podcast on subtypes, we did a podcast on instincts, and we did a podcast on countertypes. So it will be important, if you're interested in these topics, to listen to those podcasts, because I think they may answer some of your questions. But I think I'll say something about this, Uranio, and then maybe you can let us know what you think. First of all, I think it's really good to start with finding your type. Now, if you focus too much on your dominant instinct first, I think you're going to get very confused, because I just think sometimes it's really hard to know what your dominant instinct is. Just like it can be hard to know what center you come from before you know your type. Like if you ask someone who's a 1 who knows nothing about the Enneagram, they may not say they're a body type. They might say they're a head type, because 1s can be very intellectual and objective, and they can, be a lot in their heads. So I think it's good to go in the door that's easiest to find your way forward. And so I would suggest, if you're finding your type or wanting to get more certain about your type, it's good to really focus on which of the 9 types you are. Now, that said, we believe that it's really important to know the 27 subtypes, because there are some of these 27 subtypes that aren't really addressed when you just look at the 9 types alone. So it's almost like finding your type, but also studying the subtypes so that you start to have a sense of what all the possibilities are. Now, the subtype includes the too much about the dominant instinct until you first find your type and then find your subtype. Because, for instance, if you think you're a sexual dominant instinct, you have a sexual dominant instinct. Let me start again. So, for instance, maybe you believe you might have a sexual dominant instinct. Well, you could be a heart type and just be very focused on relationships, or on one-to-one relationships, or really want to connect with people at a deep level. And so it will be important for you to find your type first, because, for instance, I've seen a lot of heart types who overdetermine as sexual dominance when really it's just their heart type that is part of what they're seeing, or a big part of what they're seeing. So I would say try to find your type first, because that will help you. Then it's not a matter of differentiating between dominant instinct and type. It's more a matter of, okay, I know I'm a 4, or I know I'm a 6, or I know I'm a 9. Now the next step is which of the 3 subtypes I am. Now, again, if you're a self-preservation 4 or a social 7, one of the counter-type subtypes that can have a hard time finding your type, because in many books, you just won't be described. It will be important for you, while you're looking for your main type, which one of the 9 types you are, to have the subtypes in your mind, to be studying those at the same time, to make sure you don't miss finding your type because you are a lesser known subtype. What would you say, Uranio? How would you speak to this question of how can people differentiate which type they are versus what their dominant instinct might be?
So I really appreciate your explanation, B, and I want to build upon it. I think that we first suggest people find type, and then they go to subtype. And some people will really be sure that they are of that type when they go to the subtype level. Then they need to come back to type when that happens, to read again about the main aspects, the key aspects of that type. Some people may think they are of that type, then when they go to the subtype level, they don't really find themselves, and then they come back and open space to potentially be in another type. So it's a little bit of a dance. It's not completely linear, but indeed, we at CP Enneagram Academy suggest that people go in the sequence, like type, subtype, and then instinct. Now, when it comes to instinct, the suggestion is find your dominant instinct first by finding your subtype, as you said. And this is because the subtypes are sort of easier for us all to see happening in life. They are more straightforward descriptions of the typical behaviors, but also the typical tendencies the person has in a more visible way. Although it also carries lots of unconscious content. If you go straight to instinct, it will probably be not as easy, because it's more unconscious. But then by finding out your subtype, you will, as a consequence, know what your dominant instinct is. At that point, perhaps it's for most people, not for all, but for most, it's still a little early to explore what the repressed instinct might be, which is the third in what we call the instinctual sequence, or the weakest of the 3. And that could come perhaps a little later in your self-observation process. It's already a lot to digest about the type, subtype, and then dominant instinct. It's definitely very important you get later to what your repressed instinct is. But maybe it's not the best idea to do it all at once. Now, when you find out your dominant instinct, you need to see how much you are more like that than people of your same type. So the tricky thing here is not to compare yourself with people of another type. Let me give you an example. Like, if you think you're a 5, and then you think you might be sexual, and one of the things about sexuals is that they tend to be intense, or more intense than people of the same type. But still, you're a 5, right? So if you compare yourself with other 5s, you will find out potentially that you're more intense than them. While if you compare yourself with an 8 or a 4, chances are that you won't see yourself as being as intense as them, even if they are not sexual dominant. So make sure that you consider what it means to have that dominant instinct within your type. And for that, it's much easier when you know more people of that type, your type, than only you. But, in a way, these is even not as necessary as initially thought, because you will have explored what your dominant instinct is by simply deciding what your subtype is. Now, when it comes to your dominant instinct, instead of focusing on behavioral tendencies, what you and I suggest usually is to focus on unconscious material that is typical of that instinct, on reasons behind that, on the psychological dimension of that, on the collective historical dimension of it, on the spiritual dimension of it, and the somatic dimension of it. So more and more, we're not emphasizing as much the behavioral aspects of instincts, although they do exist.
And I do think sometimes you have to look at the behavioral dimension because that's the one that's the most obvious. For instance, we often say that to find your subtype and therefore your dominant instinct, it's important not to focus on what you think about yourself, because sometimes when we're thinking about what am I like here? What am I like? We can imagine a lot of different scenarios in our heads, but when we actually look at what we've done in our lives and the things we do every day, that's where we see the dominant instinct more clearly, because you can't really argue with the fact that you've done this, this, and this. For instance, I have a friend who's a 9, and he came to one of my workshops thinking he was a 1-to-1 9. And when I talked all about the social 9, suddenly he realized that when he looked at over the course of his life, he had been the leader of all these different organizations that he had been involved in. And it wasn't like he chose that like a different type might do, but he kind of got drafted into leadership. People asked him to be the leader. People told him they wanted him to be the leader. And then he ended up doing it and doing quite a good job. But it was like, how could I have ever thought I was anything else? Because in 10 different organizations, I was the president of my alumni association, the president of the Enneagram Association. And so that's, I think, what really helps us see what the dominant instinct is in our life. But again, for him, he went in the door of the subtype, realizing that the social 9 description fit him the most in terms of what he did in his life. Now, the psychological dimension is another dimension, and the historical collective is another, and it's good to look at those too. But sometimes, for instance, I was thinking about myself with the historical collective dimension of the instincts, and until I did some family constellation work, I don't know if I would have known what that was for me. And so it could be that it's harder to know that until you do a different kind of work, or maybe you just know something about your family history that makes it clear. But I do think there are different elements. But to make a long story short, which might be too late for that, I think it's important to say, go in the door of the type description, and even more precisely, the subtype description, and be honest with yourself about what you do. I sometimes tell my story that it was hard for me to see myself as a self-preservation too, because so much of what was getting expressed through my subtype to me was things I didn't want to look at or I wasn't aware of. Like, for instance, being very fearful. As a 2, I was repressing fear, and I didn't want to see myself as a fearful person. In pride, as a 2, wanting to have a certain image, I didn't see myself as making myself small and depending on others and being fearful. I mean, these were all things I didn't want to see. So it may take you a little bit of work to see how your dominant instinct is showing up and to see how your subtype behavior plays out and to own it. So give yourself some time, see it as a process, try to start with type, then go to subtype, ask other people in your life that know you really well to give you some reflection. But that's the way I would go, because noticing what your dominant instinct is going to be harder. And I would also say that it's good to find your instinctual sequence. What is your dominant instinct? What's your secondary instinct? And what's your repressed instinct? If you do it in the same way, look at the subtype descriptions. Which of the 3 subtypes of your type do you relate to the most, the second, and the least? And again, that may take a while. It may take a little bit of time to sort that out. I'm thinking I want to give an example of that, which pertains to another question we were asked, but anything else you want to say before I move to that example that I think supports what we're talking about here?
I think we covered a lot of it. So go ahead with your example. I think it's a good idea to illustrate.
Yeah. So we had another example, and I also have worked with people on exactly this issue. But the other question we had is, I would love to hear more about the 3 subtypes of type 6 in a more nuanced manner. They are so different. They seem like extremes. But how do you find your dominant instinct if you don't fit into those exact descriptions? So this is I think this can pertain to a lot of people, not just 6s. First of all, when you read the subtype descriptions, it's common not to relate to 100% of the description. Now, you might relate to everything that's part of the description, and you can find those descriptions in the Complete Enneagram, in my subtype booklet, and certainly in the podcast we did on subtypes. And we also have a new workshop, an online recorded workshop that is available on our website on the instincts and the subtypes. So these are ways that you can learn about the subtypes and see which one of these you relate to the most. But remember, either because of history or because of blind spots or because of different things, look for the one that fits the most. For instance, there was someone who emailing me this week saying she can't decide which subtype of 4 she might be. And she's really holding on to this one thing, saying she can't be a self-preservation 4. But that one thing she's holding on to, saying that makes it so she can't be a self-preservation 4, isn't necessarily something that is a deal breaker for being a self-preservation 4. It's something you might have, or you might have less. And again, it might also be a blind spot. So let's talk about 6 in answer to this question. So it can be hard for 6s to get clear about their subtypes and their instinctual sequence because the 3 subtypes are so different. And here's what happens. Here's what I see happening. Let's say you're self-preservation first. Your self-preservation is your dominant instinct as a 6. That makes you a self-preservation 6. Now you have certain characteristics like being warm and friendly and being more aware of fear and being someone who doubts things. These are self-preservation 6 traits. But one of the self-preservation 6 traits is not very much in touch with aggression and not really being comfortable with other people's aggression. These are also type 6 self-preservation 6 traits. Now, I worked with a person recently I was helping her sort out her subtype, and what she was saying is, I do get angry sometimes. I can be fierce. I am in touch with my anger. It's not completely a blind spot. So I don't know what 6 I am, because that maybe I'm a 1-to-1 or a sexual 6. And in fact, a friend of hers had reflected, I think you're a sexual 6 because you can be decisive and you can be strong and you can be aggressive. But when I really talked to her and said, okay, what do you tend to do most? What do you lead with first? What's your first option when it comes to dealing with fear or interacting with people in the world? And she was pretty clear that being warm and friendly was her first go-to strategy, that she was aware of fear, she was aware of doubt, that getting caught in doubt is something that happened to her on a regular basis. So what we ended up seeing was that if you're self-preservation 6 and you have sexual 6 as your second, that's kind of the opposite, right? It's not being in touch with fear. I'm sorry. it's not being in touch with anger versus being very much in touch with anger, right? And so if you have sexual 6 second, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. And for 6s especially, but for many different types, that's sometimes how it is. That you have the one that's the dominant, and the one that's in the second place is also there and also makes its presence felt. So we ended up believing that self-preservation 6 was her first one, sexual 6 was her second, and social 6 was her repressed. And it makes sense for her that she will sometimes get angry. And certainly self-preservation 6s who have sexual 6 second sometimes do get angry, especially at people they feel more comfortable with. But sometimes they'll stand up to an authority. Sometimes they will have a counterphobic response. That's normal because there is a mix. There's one that's dominant and one that's second. And the second will make itself known some of the time. So, Oronio, anything you would add to that?
I like your point, B. And because there are 3 instincts, there are 6 potential instinctual sequences. And we advocate that indeed there are these 6 different options of sequences. Because in other approaches, a few other teachers say that there are only 3 different sequences, but we don't agree. We think that there are 6 different sequences. And imagine that 3 subtypes, each subtype then has 2 different possibilities, 2 different sequences, basically switching the second with the third instinct in the sequence. Because like for the self-preservation 6, as you said, there is the self-press 6 with social second, and then the self-press 6 with the sexual second. Now, they change, and they are more visibly different even for 6s than for other types. I would say also for 4s, it's very important to know the sequence so that you understand a little more your tendencies. Now, having said that, I believe that 6s also need to know the other tendency that they have as type 6, like all 6s, and that is to doubt to the end. So we see that 6s at times don't get to the conclusion that they are 6s or what their subtype is, because they want to be more and more sure in the end, and they think, are you sure about it? It's almost a way that we validate sometimes that the person is a 6 if the person is doubting to the end. And there are other tendencies for people of other types. Like for 9s are the ones who see themselves as if they were other types. I mean, the most. They see themselves as being many other types. Or 2s or 3s might have this feeling that they can become the type that the other wants them to be. Or maybe the 4 resists to being a type because they want to be unique. So how come there are other people like me? Or 7s, they think that describing themselves as one type out of the 9 is limiting. So we all have biases when it comes to finding out our type.
Let's do a short break.
If you like this podcast, visit www.cpenneagram.com for much more great Enneagram content. The Enneagram 2.0 podcast goes live every other Thursday on all main platforms. Stay tuned to learn more about yourself and others. Have you already subscribed for B and Uraniu's YouTube channel? Go to YouTube and search for Chestnut Pies and click on like and subscribe.
Let's move on to another question. The next question is this one. This person says, I'm a social 9 with an 8 wing. Does the wing give me more qualities or the social instinct? So I think this gives us a good opportunity to clarify a little bit of what we think about wings, especially. So I would say that the answer to this is that we believe that the social instinct gives a lot more flavor, a lot more traits, determines how your personality shows up much, much, much more than any kind of wing, in this case, what this person is calling an 8-wing. We don't emphasize wings in the way that others do. We don't see them as subtypes. So in other words, when this person says, I'm a 9 with an 8-wing, in my mind, I think to myself, I have no idea what that means about this particular person, because an 8 trait or traits could flavor a 9 in many different ways. It could look very different for different 9s. And I don't really know what that means. So for us, we think, yes, the wings do flavor the main type. Each person, when they have a main type, may relate to some qualities of their wing types. Usually one is more conscious than the other, but we believe that even more important than that, wings are developmental pathways. That means you can consciously lean in one direction or another in order to broaden the fixed perspective of your main type. So we believe they're not subtypes like the instinctual subtypes are subtypes. They are whole other, more nuanced, more specific personality descriptions that tend to remain constant for most people. Again, most people won't relate to 100% of the archetypal qualities of that specific subtype, one of 27. But usually the subtype description is very instructive on how the personality manifests. Wings, however, not so much. They're less influential and they vary more according to the individual. So I always give myself as an example. I'm a 2. Someone might say, do you have a 1 wing? And I might say, well, I relate a lot to several of the 1 characteristics, but I grew up with 2 1s in my immediate family of origin, right? My brother and my father are both 1s. My brother is my only sibling. So in a family of 4, 50% of the people are 1s. So doesn't it make sense that I would be influenced by the type 1 personality in many different ways? And I can tell you those ways, if you're interested. But another 2 who didn't have 2 1s living in the household that he or she grew up in is not going to relate to 1 in the same way I do. Not at all. They may relate in different ways. Maybe they had a teacher who was a 1 who taught them a specific thing, or maybe they relate a little more to 3 and they're a little more unconscious about the ways they might relate to 1. So yes, the Enneagram Circle is a spectrum, and certainly our wings shade our main type, and it's good to learn about the wings, your wing types, as a way of knowing more about yourself. But we don't see them as a subtype. We don't see that they always influence every person in exactly the same way or to the same degree. What would you add to that, Uranio?
We do emphasize subtypes more than wings. We think it's more important to study subtypes than wings. Yes, it's okay and good to study wings, but please, if you want to choose between the 2, go study subtypes. And we think that some time ago, the American Enneagram teachers who didn't have much contact with Claudio Naranjo's work, they tried to explain the differences they saw in types with the wings because they didn't have Naranjo's approach on subtypes.
I'm glad you remember to point that out. Yes, I think this is the reason why wings have been overemphasized in our view, is because people were looking for an explanation for why do people of the same type look different sometimes. And so they thought, naturally, well, maybe it's the wing influence. One influences more than the other, and that makes someone look different. But we believe if you really study wings, they don't really account for that much difference. And if they do, again, it looks different for every person. So in a way, we often say that wings were made to carry the load of explaining the differences between types that the subtypes carry much, much better and more effectively. So that's what we think about that. Now, let's move on to another question. And well, first of all, I want to say we did get a question about most common lookalike types and subtypes. And what I would say is this is an important question, especially if you're still trying to find your type. But we did do a podcast on subtypes and also one on countertypes. And we do have this workshop now available online. And I think it might be more effective for people who are really interested in that to look at that. I think we also did a top 5 on common lookalikes. So I would direct you to there because that is an important question, and we may do a future podcast on maybe some lookalikes, but I think it's a long story, and I think we have addressed that in those podcasts. So I hope you'll look there. Now, the next question I'd like to us to address, which I think is a really good one, is what is the significance of cultural overlay? And again, this also pertains to typing to some degree, because sometimes it can be a little bit confusing for some people to find their types if they have some sort of cultural influence that is very strong, depending on what country they're from. Now, I will say that I believe that one of the amazing things about the Enneagram is that the types and the subtypes are persistently accurately descriptive across cultures. So this is a cross-cultural model. This is something you can see in many different cultures, that the types remain the same in the way they show up. That said, there is something we call a cultural overlay. So how would you describe the cultural overlay, and what do you think are the effects of it? What's the significance of the cultural overlay, Uranio?
First, the word overlay explains it a little bit. It's like the type and all the tendencies of type are intact. And then there is something on top of that, which is that cultural tendency. Now, it doesn't mean, though, that the cultural overlay is just a superficial thing. It's not. It's sometimes very determining of what happens or doesn't happen in the person's life for different reasons. And sometimes there is work to be done on that cultural overlay, especially when the person migrates or wants to work on some of those aspects for herself. But usually we don't question culture. It's like it's a given, and it's something that simply and above all needs to be respected and taken into account. Now, I want to emphasize that when I say that all the type structure is intact, regardless of the cultural origin of the person, it means that the passion for a 2 or a 5, like pride for you as a 2 or avarice for me as a 5, doesn't change much given the fact that I'm from Brazil, you're from the US, or someone who's from Germany, someone from Kenya, someone from China or Australia or Thailand. It's the same thing. The passion is the same thing, the same energy. Now, the manifestations of that passion might go one way or another, depending on the context and the cultural overlay. So it might be easier for us to find out the passion, just to go straight to the passion's energy and the overall tendency that it brings, and not only the typical behaviors. When we describe type by typical examples or behaviors, it doesn't work this way. I can give you an example. I went, the first Enneagram training I went in America, in the US, I heard a story talking about how the 9 types react when they got stopped by the police while doing something bad when driving. And as a Brazilian, doesn't matter that I was a 5. My reactions were completely different than the reactions from all nine types of Americans. And so when we specify examples to try to find out type, we are always running the risk of not getting it right. And one last thing, B, is that talking about culture and seeing the cultural aspects of each type in different places, you and I have learned a lot what's not really true when we describe type. It's like, because we see the differences, we say, oh, so it's not that 3s are always like that. Look at this person from this other country who's a 3 and does not have at all those tendencies that we talk about. And maybe we need to review what we say about 3s. So noticing how the patterns change from one culture to another teaches us what we have, the parts of our explanations of each type that aren't really accurate.
I think you've said it very well. I think the cultural overlay is exactly like you said, just that, an overlay. And in certain cultures, it's sort of frowned upon to be a certain type or to have characteristics of a certain type. For instance, in some cultures, it's not really okay to be self-promoting. And so 3s can look quite different. And I think in other cultures, it can be not very good to be rebellious, let's say, or to go against authority. And so 8s and counterphobic 6s might look a little bit different, but it doesn't mean that the underlying personality isn't the same on some way. It's just the way it presents. It's almost like some of the edges have been smoothed over, or there's a way that it presents itself that's a bit different. And so when we're typing, we need to take into account any cultural factors that may be coloring the way that the person's type shows up.
And one last aspect to consider when talking about culture, B, is that at each culture, there are types that are more easily valued and accepted and others that are not, because they are different than what is expected in the cultural dimension. So, and that changes a lot. Like there are cultures that really regard highly type 8, but others that really don't regard highly type 8. So what we see is that the types that find it more difficult to be accepted in those countries, they adapt the most, and that they don't come across in that typical way that we read in books. They disguise more.
Exactly. So again, good to know about that. And of course, you as a 5 from a 7 culture knows that better than anyone, especially as you've come to the US so much and people have accused you of not being a 5 because you're too outgoing or too good of a speaker, or you wear flashy clothes, which of course you don't pick out for yourself. So yeah, you've lived the cultural overlay more than most, probably. Okay, so let's move on to another question. We had a question which I thought was good. It's about something that we sometimes refer to in passing, but that we haven't really gone into very deeply. And this question was a good one because it started us talking a little more than we have before about this particular topic. So we got the question, some of us are self-referent 4s and who else, some other referent 2 and who else, and some data referent 5 and who else. Could you clarify more about these distinctions and how to work with them for balance, connection, and growth? So this is referring to the idea that some types, and I think there are 3 of them, are self-referencing. Some types are other referencing, and some types, I believe it's not data referencing, it's they reference both. So what does this mean? I think that what we mean when we say self-referencing or other referencing means that the person's primary focus of attention, so what they tend to refer to first when they're experiencing life, is either what's happening outside themselves, sort of how other people are feeling, what's going on in the environment, what other people think, how other people will evaluate certain things, versus someone who is, and so this can go either way, right? You can either primarily reference your internal experience, or you can primarily reference or pay attention to, focus attention on what's going on outside of you. Now, we believe, and we talked about this, we hadn't really talked about this before, but it was good to get more clarity that how we believe that the types that are self-referencing are 4, 7, and 5. And the types that are other referencing, and again, primarily focusing outside themselves as a first line of focus of attention, are 2s, 9s, and 3s. And then there are 3 more types. And I believe, and again, I think this is still in maybe the hypothesis stage, or we're still talking about this, and we may want to provide even more clarity going forward. I think the types that reference both are 6, 1, and 8. So that for these types, there's almost a kind of going back and forth. Now, I don't think this is a conscious process. I think this operates very much at the level of unconscious, like survival strategy, what you're paying attention to as a first line of either defense or just operation or a default mode. I think 6s, 1s, and 8s kind of have both. Like if you look at 1s, for instance, we often say they know what the right thing is just inside themselves. There's like a feeling or an inner sense or just a standard that they hold really clearly inside themselves of what a good outcome is or what the right thing is. But I also think that at some point in the life of a 1, they determine that based on some cultural standards, or based on what they were criticized for early on, or based on something that came to them from their families. And they also reference outside to see if other people are following the rules or doing the right thing. And so I do think there's a bit of a back and forth with 1s, 6s, and 8s. But I've said a lot, so I want to hear what you think.
I agree with you, B. And it's still a theory in the building and in progress, but I think that's probably accurate, and we'll keep investigating. Now, I agree with you also that this division between other referencing, self-referencing, and then both, or bouncing back and forth, each of them, is better than saying that there is a third category of being data referencing. But the question was really nice and made us think and discuss. We actually spent over an hour discussing.
Yes. And I think we'll want to say more about this going forward. But right now, I would just say that this is something that it's important to observe in yourself. This is something to notice about yourself. Sometimes I ask this when I'm doing typing interviews, and I notice that some people are pretty clear about it and some people really don't know. I think for instance, some 2s answer that they're self-referencing. So I think sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to even discern in yourself which you are. But I would say if you're listening to this and you're interested in this, this is something for you to start noticing in yourself. And this pertains to the part of the question that's about how do you work with this for balance and growth. And I think part of it is noticing what you tend to do. And for a while, it might just be good to notice, like, oh, I noticed that, if I'm a 2 or a 9 or a 3, I'm kind of looking outside me to get a sense of how I should be, or to get a sense of affirmation, or to know, like, how should I feel okay with what's going on or what I'm doing. Or if you're a 4 or a 7 or a 5, notice how much you're inside. Notice how much you consult the data of what you want or how you feel or what you're thinking. And just notice that for a while. And then I think eventually it's good to learn to go against that a little bit, to expand. And sometimes when we've talked a lot about using the arrow line movements, and we have a podcast on this, sometimes that can be a way of helping you. Like, for instance, I'm a 2. And when I do the work of going against the arrow and incorporating healthy type 4 qualities, part of that is going from being a little bit too much outside myself with my attention and coming inside and really spending more intentional time being more in touch with my own feelings and my own inner experience and living from that a little bit more than I tend to normally as part of my default mode of operation. Okay, I think that was a really, really good question. So next question, someone's asking for tips on how to access different centers. For instance, if you score heavily on, if you're a head type, if you're a 5, 6, or 7, how might you develop your heart center? Or how might you develop more connection to your body center? Udani, I want to hear what you have to say about this in answer to this question.
Yeah, potentially the answer to that is something we'll need to explore in a whole new podcast, but I'll try to be practical and say a few things for now. When you want to develop your head center, what you need to do mostly is to learn how to take in different perspectives. To be flexible in your mind, not to think that there is only one right answer for something. You need to put yourself in the position of other people and practice this thing calling building different scenarios. Like the head types, they have this natural ability to think of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. And it's normal. It's almost a default mode for them. Developing your mind, your head center, also has to do with being able to bring your energy up from the belly and the heart to the head, to think things through without the bias of the heart and the belly, and allowing at times yourself to make a more rational decision or to communicate more rationally. Now, if you want to develop emotionally, one idea is to pay attention to all 4 emotions, which are fear, anger, sadness, and happiness, and make sure you experience all 4. And by experiencing, what I mean is getting in touch with the emotions and doing nothing about it. It's just feeling, period. Staying there, not making decisions even. It's just feeling and expressing. And that opens up the heart center and opens up the realm of feelings. And that is important for all of us, including heart types, because at times they don't have the experience of some of the 4 emotions. Another thing to develop emotionally is to manage reactivity, which is usually emotional reactivity. And learning how to manage it is essential for emotional development. And doing therapy, right? But also, in a simple way, imagine that you can develop a bit mentally by reading news or doing crosswords or puzzles, or not puzzles, but something like Sudoku, and studying and writing, reading. And you can develop emotionally by putting yourself in situations that evoke emotions for you. And people who develop can sometimes choose like to watch movies that they wouldn't normally, just to as an emotional gym, to help them develop access to that one emotion that's harder for them. And lastly, the development of instincts. It's a lot about developing the 5 senses. So I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I decided that I needed to develop my capacity for smell, for taste, because I was too much in my head. That happened at a weekend that I was doing a meditation retreat, and I had a very good meditation experience. And during lunch, I started tasting the food in a way that I was not used to. And then I said, wow, I need more of this. And then the five in me said, go do a workshop of some kind. And I had two options, either gastronomy or wine. And then my 7-year-old, guess what, B, took me to a wine course. Right? But that was really helpful. The exercise of smelling the wine and trying to sense what there was. If I use only my head, I'll never get there. So I chose that activity to truly stimulate that sense in me.
That's such a great example, because I've drank wine with you on several occasions, and I really appreciate how you really get into the sensory experience of drinking wine, smelling wine, tasting wine, knowing. Of course, there's some knowing that comes in. Your head does get involved, but you really connect that to a felt experience that I really appreciate.
Yeah, I want to emphasize that training the instinct is about training the 5 senses, and people sometimes mistake instinct for intuition. They are different. Intuition is the 6th sense, right? So we're not talking about this. We're talking about a body competency of knowing where to go, sensing what's happening. It's like when people say, sensing where I need to go and what I need to do. Right? Don't ask me why, don't stop me, I just know. But it's a body knowledge. And exercising, making quicker decisions, also following your gut, is important for your development.
Exactly. And I know that it's been a good exercise for me at times to take a period of time and try to live more from my head, for example, like being a heart type. Now I'm pretty heady, I'm, pretty educated, and, I think of myself as, able to be in my head. But if I really approach, say, let's say for the next 3 hours or the next day, I'm really going to experience life from my head, what I notice is I keep coming back down to my heart without really realizing, if I'm not careful. And I see this in the language I use. I see this in how I start even thinking about like appreciating something. If I'm sort of appreciating something, I'm kind of back in my heart again. Or if I'm using feeling language as opposed to thinking or making sense of things, understanding language, that's often a clue. And so I think it can be good to really try to practice entering into another kind of experience, whether it, that is not your main default center, and notice. Again, I think so much of what we offer is a suggestion to experiment with different experiences and then really, really observe yourself in a very intentional way and notice, like, how hard is it to use that language? How hard is it to stay in that space? And I think you learn a lot about how we keep coming back to our default mode, and also how we can stretch ourselves by really adding in a kind of, going to another place inside ourselves as a way of growing. So there's another question that's, I think, not exactly the same question, but I think of it as a little bit connected. Someone asks, how could one person learn how to fluidly embody or integrate every number and not just the connecting lines? So first of all, I would ask you, Urani, do you think this is a good idea? And what would you say in answer to this question?
So I wouldn't start there for sure. I wouldn't try to develop access to all 9 or to the other 8 numbers apart from your own type. And the theory here is that the 2 arrows and the two wings of our dominant type are more easily accessible. They are the best possible resources, not only because they contain the solutions for our main issues, but also because it's more feasible for us to go there and get that. While for the other four types that we are not directly connected to, it's not that easy. It's not as available for us. They are a bit more foreign to us. So I wouldn't start there. The only thing I would do on this regard, like experiencing all 9 points, would be as in exercises that Gurdjieff used to do. Gurdjieff is one of the pioneers of the Enneagram who lived 100 years ago. He would do exercises of people going from one point to another and another and another, just to experience the 9 different emotions and getting in and out of different emotional patterns. But that's not to say that people would use all 9 types. It's more to develop an empathy for all 9, also to develop the very capacity of getting in and out each emotion, and to notice which are the emotional patterns that are easier for you to get in and easier or more difficult for you to get out of.
I like your answer. I was thinking very much along the same lines. I was first thinking, like, would you really want to do this, fluidly embody every number? And is it possible in one lifetime was the next thing I thought of. Not just the, but I exactly like you're saying, I do think that a big part of working with the Enneagram is noticing how we tend to be stubbornly attached to seeing the world through our own lens and coming from the perspective of our main type, and how we get stuck there in conscious and unconscious ways. And I do think that first, it's helpful to stretch out of that, to resist, to work against that stubbornness by seeking to embody the types that we're connected to. I think the wing types, the type on either side, we were saying earlier, these are developmental stretches. They're places you have easier access to start to consciously move out of always seeing things through the lens of your main type in a kind of default way that you get stuck in. And then I think the airlines are perfectly designed antidotes for your main type. They're perfectly designed balancing points. And I bow to the wisdom of the symbol in these ways, in looking first to trying to go beyond your own number by going to the wing points and the connecting line points, because first of all, it's going to be easier. And second of all, it makes sense. There's a kind of natural growth movement that comes from that is encoded in the symbol, in the diagram. Now, that said, I do think, of course, there may be moments or situations in someone's life where they think, wow, like for me as a 2, maybe it might be interesting or effective, or just something important to experiment with, to address a certain situation, thinking about how would a healthy 5 or how would a healthy 6 approach this situation. Those are 2 types I don't have any direct connection to. But I don't necessarily think that that's a place to be spending a lot of time trying to integrate that number in a deep way. Because again, we often say, you can spend your whole lifetime just trying to deal with your own number. And as you say, come out of it, or come out of the emotions that we tend to get connected to or attached to when we are in our type in an unconscious way. So I think before we seek to integrate the other numbers, we really need to make sure we're appreciating and doing all the work that's connected to our main type. And often that's actually the way out. The looser our patterns get connected to our main type, the more we are kind of going to the high side of our own number, which can be another kind of, and maybe even more effective way of growing, as opposed to becoming like or being able to embody other numbers. Let's do a short break. If you're interested in the types, the subtypes, the Enneagram generally, or the growth paths of each of the types and subtypes, you won't want to miss a special panel event that we have coming up. Uranio and I are going to moderate an online version of panels of 6 people for each type, 2 people of each subtype, on 3 Saturdays starting in mid-January. So we want to tell you about this because the early bird pricing expires on December 15th. And you might want to visit cpenneagram.com/calendar to sign up. So here's a question I think we'll have a short answer for, and that is someone's asking about relationships. What are good matches for us and why? What would you say in response to this question?
One very basic answer is that the very best type as a match for your type is the whatever type that has a similar level of awareness than you do. So it's not as much about what type is better or worse. It's more about a matching in levels of awareness and interests when it comes to inner work. At the same time, studies of different kinds show that we tend to feel more either very attracted or repulsive to another type that is similar to our parent's type, especially the parent of the opposite sex. But also there is this tendency that in the beginning, when we're not very aware, we think that our type is the best and all the other types just haven't found that yet, that the way to live life is ours. And then as time goes by, we think that ours the worst and the other ones are all better. And then finally we get to the point that we stop judging and we think that all of them are both good and not so good. So I think we we don't ask this question as much because we prefer to say, make sure that you find your way with the person of that type. And instead of searching for people of one type, allow life to do that for you, to allow yourself to see what kind of person life is bringing you. But also in a very generic way, I would say that whenever life brings you someone very different from you, it's because you need to develop a lot those features, and you need to see yourself in the mirror to develop more tolerance for that person who's so different from you.
Yeah, I always say that for every person of a particular type, there are going to be ways that they relate well to every other type and ways that they might get in trouble with every other type. In fact, I've created a relationship grid that I want to put on CP Online in the next month. That basically says that it's a little bit more focused on workplace relationships, but it's how every type can get along well with every other type and how every type can get in trouble with every other type. So I just think that there are no perfect matches for any type. I do think that there are natural things that you can see that would work well with each pair of types and natural things that might not work so well. But as you said, more than anything else, what determines a good match or who's going to be a good partner is the level of awareness. Is that person able to self-reflect? Is that person able to apologize or take responsibility when they do something that's not so good? Can that person really understand themselves at a deep enough level to really understand what they're bringing to the relationship in terms of what they project onto the other person and what their tendencies are, because the level of consciousness is going to be what really matters when it comes to getting into a relationship.
Also, be the stage of life, sometimes is important. Like I have a 7th friend who always found it extremely difficult to relate with 4s. But from a certain point of his life, even though he doesn't do much inner work, he started to be a lot attracted to 4s. And that was because he was willing to explore a little bit more of his inner world. He was interested. He didn't use any inner work technique, but on a later stage of his life, he was interested in that. So that might happen.
So the last question we'll take for today is a question that I think just allows us to talk a little bit more about a couple of projects we're working on. So the question is, if you could co-author a book, what would you each bring to it? So it's interesting that this person is asking this question because we actually just finished a book. We just turned it into our publisher, and it will be coming out next year. And we were actually approached by a publisher to write this book. It probably isn't the one that we would have thought of, although I was really wanting to write a book like this. It's basically going to be a more introductory book about the Enneagram, but it doesn't focus on just giving information about the types and subtypes. It focuses very much on the path of development of each type. And I think what each of us brought to it is what we brought in common is a really strong desire, commitment to focus on applying the Enneagram to help people understand what their work is, what their path forward is, and what the different general stages are of those works. So we talked about this in terms of a 3-step path, basically kind of identifying your type and self-observing to start identifying key patterns. And then a second stage, which is more about exploring the shadow and making unconscious tendencies more conscious. And then a third step that was, loosely speaking, more about starting to embrace the high side and starting to get more in touch with the virtue of the type, moving from being aware of the passion of the type to the virtue of the type, and starting to get a taste of that higher side so that you can continue working to manifest more of that. So that's the book that we just wrote that will be coming out next year. Anything you want to say about that? I know in terms of different skills we brought, I know that, I have some experience writing, and so I was able to help with the organization and the writing of it, but took a lot of inspiration from Uranio in terms of the way he describes some of the particular developmental experiences of the types and his commitment to really talking about what's really required on that path of development. What would you add to that?
I think you and I have similarities when writing, mainly that we write too much and we go too much into depths of understandings.
Yes.
But you are better than me when it comes to making sure that a person will understand you more easily. And I believe that I still have this tendency that it's much better today, but I still do have a little bit of this tendency to speak in sophisticated ways, hoping that people who will, be more interested in that will get what I'm saying and so on. But so that's not as good. But also, I think that usually our dynamics is that although both of us come up with theories, that I think of that a bit more, and then I run them through you and we discuss. And there is this thing about me, it's a limitation I have, that I need to come up with my ideas before doing a brainstorm with anyone else. And then I discuss. While for you, it's not as much like that. So it's lovely to see the differences, and that reflects in the ways that we write books or how we think we would contribute differently to writing a book.
So we can tell people for the first time publicly, the working title of that new book that comes out next year is called Be You Now. And the subtitle is The Enneagram Guide to Waking Up and Discovering Your True Self. So that's the book that will be coming out next year. And I'm excited that that will be happening. And again, we had a lot of help from the publisher and the publisher's editor to make it a shorter book, because both of us are really bad at doing short things. But that's happening. And then we might as well mention that we're also working on another book, which is a deeper, longer book that's about the inner growth process and all the things that need to be done along the way, and in people's individualized type-based growth process. And I'm excited about that book as well. And now that we've finished the other book, we're going to start working more on that one. So we want to thank you so much for listening. Join us again for our Enneagram 2.0 podcast, where we talk about all things Enneagram.